Hello and welcome to Europe After Midnight. Picture a mountaintop banquet hall, its tables groaning with nectar and ambrosia, its guests immortal. Every god and goddess of Olympus has been invited to this wedding, every one but a single uninvited guest. She was the goddess of discord, and she was furious. Into that golden hall she rolled a single golden apple, inscribed with 3 words, "For the fairest." It seems a small thing, a party trick, a petty insult repaid. But that one apple, tossed in spite onto a marble floor, would end an age. It would burn a city to ash, empty 1,000 homes of their sons, and give the world its first and greatest story of love, pride, and war. Why would 3 goddesses tear a wedding apart over a piece of fruit? And how could one prince's choice between them cost so many lives that had nothing to do with him at all? This is the story the ancient Greeks told about that war, not just the 9 days of rage that Homer's Iliad itself recounts, but the full myth built up around it by poets across centuries, from the golden apple to the wooden horse. We will trace the war from its strange and vain beginning to the moment Helen's face launched 1,000 ships. We will watch the Greek army grind through 9 long years outside Troy's walls. We will witness Achilles, the greatest warrior alive, refuse to lift his sword over a wound to his pride, and watch that refusal cost the life of the man he loved most. We will follow his terrible return to battle, and Hector's last stand before the gates of his own city. And we will end where the war itself ends, with a wooden horse, a night of fire, and the silence that follows. But before we begin, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It's a simple way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me. I'd also love to know where in the world and at what hour you're joining me tonight. Do share in the comments. And now, settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away and let us travel back to a time of bronze swords and burning ships, to the sound of oars dipping into a dark and waiting sea. Our story begins not on a battlefield, but at a wedding. The bride was a sea nymph named Thetis. The groom was a mortal king named Peleus. It was, by every account, a match no one had wanted, least of all Thetis herself, and it had only come to pass because of a prophecy. It was said that Thetis was destined to bear a son greater than his father, a son who might one day rival Zeus himself. To protect his throne, Zeus arranged for her to marry a mortal instead of a god, ensuring her extraordinary child would be born merely a hero, not a threat to Olympus. All of the gods attended the wedding to smooth over the insult. All, that is, except Eris, the goddess of strife and discord. She had not been invited, and everyone assumed she never would be. Discord was not welcome at a wedding, but Eris did not accept exclusion quietly. As the story is told, she arrived anyway, uninvited and unannounced, and rolled a golden apple into the middle of the feast. Carved into its skin were 3 words, "To the fairest." 3 goddesses reached for it at once: Hera, queen of Olympus, wife of Zeus; Athena, goddess of wisdom and war; and Aphrodite, goddess of love and desire. None would yield the claim to another, and soon their quarrel threatened to unravel the very wedding meant to honor them. Zeus, unwilling to choose a favorite among his own wife and daughters, did what any wise ruler does when a decision is too costly to make himself. He passed it along. He decreed that the choice would fall not to a god, but to a mortal man, a shepherd prince on a hillside in Anatolia, a young man named Paris. Paris was a son of Troy, though he did not know it yet. He had been raised as a simple shepherd on Mount Ida, exiled at birth by his own father because of a prophecy that he would one day bring ruin to his city. He had no notion of politics, or Olympus, or the sort of war 3 goddesses could start with a single piece of fruit. He was simply a young man tending his flock when 3 of the most powerful beings in the universe descended before him, each demanding to be named the fairest. Each goddess understood that Paris was, in the end, only human, and each came prepared to bribe him accordingly. Hera promised him power beyond any king's, dominion over all of Asia. Athena promised him wisdom and unmatched skill in war, and Aphrodite promised him something far simpler and far more devastating. She promised him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris did not hesitate long. He handed the golden apple to Aphrodite. On its surface, a young man's understandable choice, but it came with a catastrophic complication that Aphrodite had conveniently left unmentioned. The most beautiful woman in the world was not unattached. Her name was Helen, and she was already the wife of a Greek king named Menelaus, ruler of Sparta. Soon afterward, Paris travelled to Sparta itself, ostensibly on a diplomatic visit, and was welcomed as an honoured guest in Menelaus's own palace. He sat at the king's table. He slept under the king's roof, and there he met Helen, and by Aphrodite's design, or perhaps by nothing more than mortal longing, the two fell into a passion that would not be denied. When Menelaus was called away from his own halls on other business, Paris seized his chance. He and Helen fled together, sailing east across the wine-dark sea toward Troy, and taking with them a portion of the Spartan king's treasury. Whether Helen went willingly or was taken by force is a question the old poets themselves never fully agree on, and one we may never resolve. What is certain is that when Menelaus returned to an empty palace and a wife gone from his bed, his grief curdled swiftly into rage, and that rage would not stay contained within Sparta's walls for long. Menelaus had a brother, and this made all the difference. His name was Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, the most powerful ruler in all of Greece. And Menelaus had one further advantage he could call upon, an old and binding promise. Years before, when Helen's hand in marriage had been contested by nearly every great lord in Greece, her father had feared the losers might turn violent against whichever suitor was chosen. So he had bound every one of them to a solemn oath. Whoever became Helen's husband, all the rest would defend that marriage should it ever be threatened. Now that oath came due. Menelaus called on it, and one by one the kings and princes of Greece answered, some out of loyalty, some out of ambition, and at least one, a clever king of Ithaca named Odysseus, out of no desire at all. As the story is told, Odysseus feigned madness to escape the summons, yoking a donkey and an ox to his plough and sowing his fields with salt instead of seed. But the ruse did not survive a single test. When the men sent to fetch him placed his infant son directly in the plough's path, Odysseus swerved the blade aside to spare the child, and in that one instinctive act revealed his sanity to everyone watching. He would sail for Troy after all. Across the shores of Greece, ships were being built and hulls were being tarred, and men who had never met Menelaus, who had no true quarrel with Troy at all, began sharpening spears they would carry for the next 10 years. A wedding feast, a stolen bride, a promise sworn years before to a woman's father. Small threads, each one, and yet together they were pulling all of Greece toward a war that would outlast a generation. Somewhere across the sea, a young prince named Paris was, for now, simply in love. He did not yet understand the size of the storm his choice on that hillside had summoned, nor did he understand that his own city, his father's city, high-walled Troy, would pay the price for it first. The ships gathered first at a harbour called Aulis, a narrow strait on the Greek coast, where the winds could turn a fleet of 1,000 vessels into 1,000 ships going nowhere at all. And that is precisely what happened. Agamemnon's grand armada, gathered from every kingdom in Greece, sat becalmed for days, then weeks, its sails hanging limp, its soldiers restless, its supplies dwindling with every windless dawn. The priests were consulted, and the news they brought back was not welcome. The goddess Artemis, they said, had been offended by Agamemnon, and she was holding the winds hostage until the insult was repaid. The price she demanded was almost too terrible to speak aloud. Agamemnon would have to sacrifice his own daughter, a girl named Iphigenia, upon the altar, or the fleet would never leave Aulis at all. Agamemnon was a proud man, and an ambitious one, and he had staked his reputation before every king in Greece on leading this expedition to Troy. He sent word home to his wife, Clytemnestra, with a lie wrapped inside it. "Bring Iphigenia to Aulis," he wrote, "for she is to be married to the great warrior Achilles before the fleet departs." The girl arrived expecting a wedding. She found, instead, an altar. What happened next, the old poets tell in different ways. In some versions, the girl understood her fate and walked to the altar herself. Her courage stunned the assembled soldiers. She chose to die so that Greece might have its war. In others, Artemis pitied her at the final moment and spirited her away, leaving a deer in her place upon the stone. But every version agrees on what came after. The winds returned, the sails filled, and the fleet of 1,000 ships finally pulled out of Aulis, carrying with it a father who had traded his daughter for a favourable wind, and a war that had not yet seen its first true battle, but had already claimed its first sacrifice. The crossing to Troy was long, and when the Greek ships finally beached upon that foreign shore, the Trojans were waiting. The first man to leap from his ship onto Trojan sand did not live to see the sun set. An oracle had warned that whoever touched Trojan soil first would be the first to die, and a warrior named Protesilaus, either braver or less informed than his comrades, sprang ashore ahead of everyone else, and was cut down within moments by a Trojan spear. This would not be a short war, easily won, and it would not be a cheap one either. Troy itself was no humble settlement waiting to be swept aside. Its walls were high, thick, and, by legend, built in part by the god Poseidon himself. Behind them ruled old King Priam, a man who had fathered some 50 sons, and whose greatest of all was Hector, a prince as devoted to his city and his family as his younger brother Paris had been careless with both. Troy had allies of its own besides, warriors and kings from across Anatolia who marched to defend her walls. This would not be a quick raid. It would be a siege, and sieges, as every general in that assembled Greek army understood, are won not in a single afternoon of glory but through years of grinding, patient attrition. And so the years came, one after another, 9 of them in total, and the 10th would prove to be the last. For 9 long years, the Greek army camped upon the beach, outside Troy's walls, their ships drawn up on the sand behind them, like a wooden fence between themselves and home. They built no permanent city there. They lived instead in a sprawling camp of tents and huts, a temporary world of soldiers waiting, always waiting, for the war to finally break in their favour. Troy's walls, meanwhile, held. Every direct assault the Greeks attempted broke against that stone like a wave against a cliff. So the war settled into something else entirely. Not one long siege, but a slow, exhausting campaign across the wider region. Instead of storming Troy itself, the Greeks turned their spears against the smaller cities and villages allied with her, raiding them for supplies, for plunder, and for captives, slowly starving Troy of the support that kept her fed and her allies loyal. Of all the Greek warriors who carried out these raids, none was more feared or more effective than a young man named Achilles. He was the son of that same sea nymph Thetis, whose wedding had begun this entire chain of catastrophe, and his father was the mortal king Peleus. It was said that his mother, desperate to protect her son from the mortality of his father's blood, had dipped him as an infant into the river Styx, holding him by the heel, the one place the river's protection never touched. Whether or not that story was literally true, what was certain to every soldier on that beach was this: Achilles fought like no other man alive. He was faster, stronger, and more ferocious in battle than any warrior on either side of the war, and both armies knew it. Achilles led raid after raid against the towns surrounding Troy, sacking a dozen or more cities in the region over those 9 years, seizing plunder, cattle, gold, and captives, and steadily weakening the network of allies that kept Priam's city fed and defended. He was, in every sense, winning the war for Greece, city by city, raid by raid, even as Troy's central walls remained unbroken. But warriors who win so much plunder eventually create a new problem entirely their own, a question of who gets to keep the spoils. And it was this exact question, seemingly so small beside the scale of the war itself, that would soon bring the entire Greek campaign to the edge of collapse. Among the captives taken in one of these raids was a young woman named Chryses, daughter of a priest of the god Apollo, and she was given, as war prizes so often were, to the commander of the entire Greek army, Agamemnon himself. It seemed, at the time, an unremarkable transaction, one captive among hundreds distributed after a successful raid. Agamemnon could not have known what this one prisoner would cost him. His refusal to give her up was about to summon the wrath of a god against his own army. It would also drive away the one warrior the Greeks could least afford to lose. The priest's name was Chryses, and he was an old man when he walked down to the Greek camp, carrying with him a fortune in ransom and a shepherd's staff wound with the sacred wool of Apollo, the mark of a man under that god's protection. His daughter Chrysis was among the Greeks now, claimed by Agamemnon after the raid that had taken her, and the old priest had come to buy her freedom, offering more gold than most soldiers on that beach would see in a lifetime. Agamemnon refused him. Worse, he refused him with contempt, warning the old man that if he ever set foot in the Greek camp again, his priestly staff and sacred garlands would not protect him. Chryses left in silence. But he did not go home to grieve. He walked instead to the shore, and lifted his hands toward the sea, and prayed to Apollo, the god he had served his whole life, to punish the men who had scorned him. Apollo answered. For 9 days the god's arrows fell upon the Greek camp, not as thunderbolts or lightning, but as plague. Soldiers sickened and died. The funeral pyres burned constantly along the beach, filling the air with smoke that never seemed to clear. I, Achilles, not Agamemnon, finally called an assembly to address the dying. A prophet named Calchas revealed the plague's true cause, but only once he'd been promised protection from Agamemnon's anger. The god was punishing the army, he explained, because its commander had refused to return the priest's daughter. There was only one way to end the suffering. Chryseis had to be given back. Agamemnon had no real choice, and he knew it. But a proud king, forced to surrender something in front of his entire army, rarely surrenders gracefully. If he had to give up his prize, he announced, then he would take another man's prize in exchange. And his eyes settled on Briseis, a captive woman who had been awarded to Achilles himself after one of his own raids. It was, on the surface, a small demand, one captive traded for the sake of a commander's wounded pride, but Achilles did not see it that way, and he said so in front of the entire assembled army. He had fought harder than any man in that camp, he reminded them all, sacked more cities, taken more risks, and won more plunder for the common cause, while Agamemnon, safe behind the front lines, reaped the rewards without ever earning them. Now, that same commander meant to strip him of his own hard-won prize, simply because his own had been taken from him. The loss of Briseis alone did not enrage Achilles. Her seizure was a public humiliation of the one thing a warrior in that world valued above his own life, his honor, the recognition owed to him for what he had risked and won. The two men's fury spilled into open confrontation before the whole assembly. Achilles' hand went to the hilt of his sword, and for a moment it seemed as though the war's greatest warrior might cut down his own commander on the spot. As the story is told, it was the goddess Athena herself, invisible to every eye but his, who seized him by the hair and stayed his hand before blood could be spilled between Greeks. Achilles held his sword, but he did not hold his tongue. He swore before the entire army that he would fight no longer. Agamemnon could keep his stolen prize and lead his war without him. Achilles was going back to his tents and taking his men, the fearsome Myrmidons, with him. Agamemnon let Briseis be taken from Achilles' tent that same day, and Achilles, true to his oath, withdrew entirely from the fighting. He did something more besides. He asked his mother Thetis to carry a request to Zeus himself, king of all the gods. Let the Trojans push the Greeks back toward their ships, he asked her. Let Agamemnon and every soldier who had stood silent while his honor was stripped from him learn exactly how much they needed the warrior they had scorned. Thetis carried her son's plea to Olympus, and Zeus, however reluctantly, granted it. From that day forward, the tide of the war began to turn. Without Achilles and his Myrmidons on the field, the Greek army's fortunes collapsed with startling speed. Hector, Troy's greatest defender, sensed the weakness in the Greek line almost immediately, and he pressed his advantage without mercy. Battle after battle, the Trojans drove the Greeks back from the plain they had held for 9 years, back past the positions they had defended for a decade, back toward the beach itself, toward the very ships that were the Greek army's only way home. Agamemnon, watching his campaign crumble in the absence of a single warrior, was forced into a reckoning with his own pride. Old Nestor, the army's wisest and most respected counselor, urged him to swallow that pride and make amends. Agamemnon listened, and sent an embassy of the army's most respected men Odysseus, the massive warrior Ajax, and Phoenix, who had helped raise Achilles as a boy to Achilles' tent, bearing an offer of extraordinary generosity. Briseis would be returned, untouched. Agamemnon would add treasures beyond counting: gold, horses, tripods, women, even the promise of one of his own daughters in marriage, and cities to rule besides. Any reasonable man's wounded honor would have been satisfied 100 times over. Achilles refused it. His answer to the embassy was not the response of a man simply negotiating for a better price. It was the answer of a man who had looked, in his fury and his grief, straight into the heart of what this war had actually cost him, and found the reward no longer worth the risk. He told them plainly that no treasure, however vast, could replace a life once it was spent, and that he had begun to wonder whether all the glory in the world was worth trading for the years he might otherwise have lived in peace. Cattle and gold could be won and won again, he said, but a man's life, once gone, could never be recovered by any ransom. It was, in truth, no longer only about Briseis at all. She had been the spark, but what burned in Achilles now was something larger. The question of what glory was actually worth, if it could be stripped away by any king with the power to do it, and given back only when that same king found himself desperate enough to beg. The embassy returned to Agamemnon empty-handed, and the Greek army, still without its greatest warrior, went back to a battlefield that was slowly grinding them down toward the sea. Achilles sat outside his tent as the fighting raged in the distance, listening to the sounds of a war he refused to join, still certain that his pride was worth more than his return to the field, still unaware that the price of his absence was about to be paid not by Agamemnon, not by the army that had wronged him, but by the one person in that entire camp he loved, beyond every other, the friend who had grown up at his side since they were boys, a warrior named Patroclus. With Achilles gone from the field, the war became something the Greeks had not experienced in 9 long years, a war they were losing. Hector, Prince of Troy, led his men out from behind those high walls not to defend, but to attack, and for the first time since the fleet had landed on that shore, it was the Trojans who advanced and the Greeks who gave ground. Hector was, in nearly every way that mattered, the opposite of Paris, the brother whose stolen bride had started this whole catastrophe. Where Paris was careless, vain, and more comfortable with a lyre than a spear, Hector was disciplined, dutiful, and utterly devoted to the people he had been born to protect. He fought not for plunder or glory, though he earned plenty of both. He fought because Troy was his home. His wife Andromache and his infant son Astyanax were within those walls, and he understood, more clearly than any other man in the war, exactly what would happen to them if it fell. This clarity gave his sword arm a purpose that no Greek warrior, fighting for another man's stolen wife on a foreign shore, could entirely match. Battle by battle, Hector pushed the Greek line backward across the plain the two armies had contested for nearly a decade. He killed Greek captains by the dozen, shattered their formations, and at last accomplished something no Trojan had managed in all the years of siege before. He broke through the wall the Greeks had built to protect their beached ships, tore a gate from its hinges with a boulder no ordinary man could lift, and led the Trojan army directly onto the sand where the Greek fleet lay drawn up in rows. If those ships burned, the Greek army would have no way home at all. It would die on that foreign shore, however the war itself ended. The fighting around the ships grew desperate. One captain in particular held the line almost single-handedly, a giant of a man named Ajax, second only to Achilles in raw strength among all the Greeks. He fought from the deck of his own ship, with a spear in each hand, cutting down every Trojan who came close enough to set a torch to the hull, retreating from prow to prow as Hector's men pressed closer, buying the rest of the army precious hours with nothing but his own exhausted arms. But even Ajax could not hold every ship alone forever, and the fires were coming. Word of the disaster reached Achilles in his tent, where he still sat in his self-imposed exile, listening to the screams and the clash of bronze drifting up from the beach below. He had asked Zeus for exactly this, a Greek army humbled and desperate enough to recognize how much they needed him. He was getting it in full measure. He still did not rise to take up his sword. His pride, wounded so deeply by Agamemnon's insult, would not let him simply walk back onto the field as though nothing had happened, not even with the ships themselves catching fire. Patroclus could not bear to watch any longer. Patroclus had grown up alongside Achilles since they were both boys, sent to the same household to be raised together, and in the years since, he had become something closer than a comrade in arms, closer than a brother. He shared Achilles' tent, his table, his closest confidants, and now, watching the Greek army bleed and burn on the beach below, while his friend sat idle in stubborn fury, he found he could no longer watch. He went to Achilles and wept before him, begging him to reconsider, or if his pride would not permit that, then to at least allow Patroclus himself to take up Achilles' armour and lead the Myrmidons back into the fight in his place. The mere sight of that armour on the battlefield, Patroclus argued, might be enough to convince the Trojans that Achilles had returned and turn the tide of the battle without Achilles having to surrender an inch of his wounded pride. Achilles considered the request, and at last he agreed, though not without a warning. Patroclus could wear the armour. He could drive the Trojans back from the ships, but he was to go no further than that. He was not to pursue the retreating enemy toward the walls of Troy itself, and above all, he was not to face Hector in single combat. Achilles' fear, buried beneath his anger, was plain enough. He did not want to lose the one friend closer to him than any other, not even to win back the honour that had been stripped from him. Patroclus armed himself in Achilles' own bronze, gathered the Myrmidons who had sat as idle as their leader through all these weeks of fighting, and led them screaming onto the beach. The effect was immediate, and it was exactly what Patroclus had hoped for. The Trojans, seeing that unmistakable armour descending upon them, believed Achilles himself had returned to the war, and something close to panic spread through their ranks. Men who had pressed forward with confidence moments before now scrambled back from the ships, and the fire that had nearly consumed the Greek fleet was beaten out. Patroclus drove deep into the retreating Trojan lines, cutting down warrior after warrior, and for a brief, brilliant stretch of the afternoon, it seemed as though he alone might reverse the entire course of the war. But triumph, in this story, is never permitted to last. Patroclus, caught up in the momentum of his own success, forgot Achilles' warning entirely. Instead of stopping once the ships were safe, he pursued the fleeing Trojans all the way to the very walls of the city, exactly the ground Achilles had told him never to cross. 3 times he scaled the wall's defences, and 3 times he was thrown back, until at last the god Apollo himself intervened directly, striking the armour from Patroclus' body with an unseen hand and leaving him stunned and defenceless in the middle of the battlefield, no longer protected by the disguise that had carried him so far. Stripped of Achilles' armour and Apollo's favour both, Patroclus was defenceless when Hector found him. A Trojan spear from another hand had already wounded Patroclus by the time Hector reached him, and the Prince of Troy, seeing his enemy already faltering, did not hesitate. He drove his spear through the wounded man and stood over him as he fell. Patroclus, with the last breath left in him, told Hector something the Trojan prince did not want to hear, that his own death was already coming, and soon, at the hands of a warrior far greater than either of them, a warrior who was, even now, still sitting idle in his tent by the ships. Hector did not believe him, or did not wish to. He stripped Achilles' armour from the body where it lay and put it on himself, a trophy of his greatest victory in 9 years of war. But somewhere across that same battlefield, a runner was already sprinting toward the Greek camp, carrying news that would end Achilles' long, stubborn silence forever, and would summon a fury far greater than the one that had kept him from the war in the first place. The runner who reached Achilles' tent was his own dear friend Antilochus, and he did not soften what he had come to say. He arrived breathless, his face already wet with tears before he spoke a single word, and Achilles, watching him approach, felt his stomach drop before he understood why. Patroclus was dead, Antilochus told him. Hector had killed him and stripped the armour from his body, and even now the fighting still raged over the corpse as Greek and Trojan alike struggled to drag it toward their own lines. What happened to Achilles in that moment was not simply sorrow, it was something closer to the collapse of the world itself. He fell to the ground and clawed at his own hair with both hands, and poured fistfuls of dark ash over his head and his fine tunic, grinding it into his own skin, as though grief were something that could be worn like armour. The sound that came from him was so raw, so unlike any cry his men had heard before, that the women of the camp came running from their tents in fear. Among them, a captive herself, was Briseis, the very woman whose seizure had begun this entire quarrel. She knelt over the news of Patroclus' death and wept for him too, for he alone among the Greeks had always treated her with a gentleness the war rarely allowed, promising her once, she remembered now, that Achilles would make her his lawful wife when they returned home to Greece. That promise, like so much else, would never be kept. Achilles' cry carried further than the camp. It reached down through the water itself to his mother Thetis, who rose from the sea with her sister nymphs around her, and found her son collapsed in the sand, and held him as he told her, in broken pieces, what had happened. He no longer wished to live, he said, not if Patroclus was dead, and Hector still walked the earth to boast of it. He knew because his mother had told him so long before that his own fate was bound to Hector's, thread for thread. If he killed the Trojan prince in revenge, his own death would follow soon after, and follow quickly. He said he no longer cared. Life without Patroclus, he told her, held nothing left worth protecting. There remained, however, one immediate and practical problem beneath all that grief. Hector had stripped Achilles' own armour from Patroclus' body on the battlefield and worn it away as a trophy, and Achilles now had none left to wear into the war he intended to rejoin that very day. So Thetis, in her son's hour of need, did not go to a mortal blacksmith. She went to a god. She travelled down through the sea to the bronze-walled palace of Hephaestus, the divine smith of Olympus, who owed her an old favour from the days when he himself had been cast down from heaven and she alone had sheltered him. She found him at his forge, sweat on his brow, working the bellows of 20 furnaces at once, and she asked him to make her son new armour equal to the fury he was about to unleash upon the world. Hephaestus agreed without hesitation, and what he shaped that night in his forge was described by those who later saw it as something closer to a small universe, rendered in bronze, tin, silver, and gold. Upon the great round shield he hammered out first, he set the earth, and the sky, and the sea, the sun in its full strength, and the moon nearly full, and the constellations wheeling above them all, the bear that never bathes in the ocean's stream. He set 2 cities upon it besides, one at peace, weddings underway in its streets, torches carried, the sound of the wedding song and pipes and lyres rising even in bronze, and men gathered in its marketplace disputing a blood price before their elders. And he set a second city at war, besieged by armies exactly as Troy itself now was, its people arguing behind their walls whether to yield or to fight on, an ambush laid in a riverbed, cattle driven off, the god of war and the goddess of strife both walking among the dying. He set fields of harvest worked by labourers with sickles, a vineyard heavy with grapes and boys and girls carrying the sweet fruit in baskets, a herd of cattle attacked by 2 savage lions while the herdsman's dogs held back in fear, and a dancing floor crowded with young men and women, their hands on each other's wrists, whirling in a circle exactly as potters test a wheel beneath their palms. All the ordinary business of human life, laid out in careful relief upon a single shield meant for a warrior who no longer wished to live in that world at all. I.A. Morning Man had rarely been given a crueler gift, an entire vision of peaceful human life, handed to someone walking back into slaughter. Before Achilles could take up that shield, there remained one more matter to settle, and pride, even now, was not so easily set aside on either side. He had not spoken to Agamemnon since the quarrel that had started this entire chain of grief. But grief, it turned out, could accomplish what pride alone could not. Achilles called an assembly of the whole army at dawn, still hollow-eyed from his mourning, and declared before every soldier gathered there that he was setting his anger aside at last. Whatever quarrel had existed between the 2 of them over a captive woman, he said, it no longer mattered beside the plain fact that Greeks kept dying on that beach, while he and his commander nursed their wounded pride in silence. Agamemnon, for his part, rose and admitted his own fault as openly as a proud king ever manages, blaming the madness sent by the gods for clouding his judgment that day, and he returned Briseis to Achilles untouched, along with every gift the earlier embassy had promised, tripods and gold and horses carried out before the whole army as proof of his sincerity. Achilles barely seemed to hear the terms. Gold and captive women no longer moved him in the slightest. Only one thing did, and it was waiting for him across the plain, inside the walls of Troy. He armed himself piece by piece in the armour his mother had brought him, still warm from the god's forge. The greaves first, then the breastplate, then the sword slung across his shoulder, and last of all he lifted the great shield, feeling its unnatural weight settle against his arm. That whole small world of weddings and harvests and dancing floors turned now to face an enemy. He climbed into his chariot. His immortal horses, gifts from the gods to his father long before, spoke to him with a human voice as he took up the reins. Hardened soldiers standing nearby went pale at the sound. The horses warned him plainly. They would carry him swiftly into battle that day, but his own death was not far off, and no god would prevent it when it came. Achilles heard the warning, and answered without a flicker of fear in his voice. He knew his fate already, he said. He meant to meet it anyway. The gates of the Greek camp were flung open, and Achilles drove out onto the plain at last, 10 years of war behind him, and Hector somewhere ahead, and the Trojans, watching that terrible bronze shield catch the morning light from across the field, understood before a single spear was thrown that something had changed in the character of this war forever. What followed was less a battle than an unleashing. Achilles drove his chariot into the Trojan lines that morning, like a man who had already decided he had nothing left to lose, and in some sense, he had not. Grief had stripped away every restraint that might once have tempered his fighting, and the Trojan soldiers who found themselves in his path that day discovered a warrior fighting less like a man defending his honour than like a force that simply could not be reasoned with, bargained with, or outrun. The first to fall before him was a young Trojan named Iphicyon, struck down as he led his own countrymen into the fray, and after him came a procession of names the old poets took care to record: sons of priests, sons of kings, young men who had grown to manhood during these same 10 years of siege and had never known Troy at peace. Achilles cut through them without pause, and word of his return spread through the Trojan ranks faster than any messenger could carry it, spread simply by the sight of bodies falling in a line wherever his chariot turned. Among those who crossed his path that morning was Aeneas, a Trojan prince and kinsman of the royal house, a man who would, in later ages, be remembered as the ancestor of Rome itself. The two met in single combat, and for a moment it seemed Aeneas might share the fate of every other Trojan Achilles had already killed that day. But Poseidon himself intervened to save him, wrapping him in a mist and spiriting him from the battlefield, entirely a strange mercy from a god who otherwise favoured the Greeks in this war, but it was not yet Aeneas's fate. The old stories tell us to die at Troy. Achilles let him go, more puzzled than angry, and turned his fury back toward the rest of the retreating Trojan line, for there were other names waiting for him that morning, and one above all the rest. The Trojan army broke before him more completely with every passing hour, streaming back across the plain toward the river Scamander that ran along the edge of the battlefield, hoping its waters might slow the Greek pursuit long enough for them to reach the safety of the walls beyond. It did not slow Achilles at all. He drove into the river itself after them, and there, in the water, the slaughter grew so vast that the current itself began to choke on the dead, bodies piling against the banks faster than the river could carry them away. The river god rose against him. The soldiers who witnessed it found no metaphor could explain it away. The waters of the Scamander surged up out of their banks in a great wave, wrapping around Achilles' legs, dragging at him, filling his ears with a roaring voice that accused him directly of choking a god's own waters with more corpses than any river should be made to carry. Achilles fought the flood as he fought every mortal enemy, refusing to yield an inch. But the river was patient and relentless in a way no soldier could be. Slowly it gained the advantage, rising higher around him, threatening to drown the greatest warrior of the Greek army beneath nothing more than mud and current, a death that would have mocked everything he had already sacrificed to reach that field. It was Hephaestus, the same god who had forged Achilles' armour at Thetis' request, who came to his rescue now, sending a wall of divine fire racing across the plain to boil back the floodwaters until the river itself, scorched and diminished, was forced to relent and withdraw within its banks once more. Achilles emerged from the Scamander, soaked, exhausted, and entirely unbowed, and if anything, his fury had only deepened for having been made to fight a god as well as an army in the same single morning. The Trojan army, what remained of it after the river and the fighting both, fled before him in something close to open terror now, streaming back toward the safety of their own walls in a rout so complete that old King Priam himself, watching from the ramparts, ordered the great gates thrown open early to receive his retreating soldiers before the Greek pursuit could catch them in the open. He stood above the gate and watched his own men scrambling home ahead of a single warrior who seemed, in that terrible hour, less like a man than like some force of nature that no wall built by human hands, or even by a god's hands, could ever really hope to stop. Every Trojan soldier who could reach those gates in time made it safely inside the walls that day. Every soldier but one. Hector alone remained outside when the gates swung shut behind the last of the retreating army. Standing before the very entrance his own father was now frantically calling him to pass through. He had watched the rout unfold from a position near the wall, and something in him, some mixture of duty and pride he could not fully separate even from himself, had kept his feet planted on the open ground rather than carrying him back inside to safety with the rest of his men. Across the plain, still wet from the river, still spattered with the blood of a dozen Trojan princes, Achilles was walking toward him now, and the war that had begun 10 years before with a stolen woman and a golden apple was narrowing, at last, down to the width of the ground between these two men. Priam called down from the wall in a voice that had already buried too many sons to bury this one gladly. He begged Hector to come inside, reminding him of brothers already lost to this same war, warning him that facing Achilles alone in the state he was in now would only add one more name to a list of grief already too long for any father to carry. Hecuba, Hector's mother, added her own pleading beside her husband's from the same high wall, calling down to the son she had nursed at her own breast, asking him to remember that love now, if nothing else could move him. Hector heard both of them clearly across the empty ground, and for a long moment he wavered where he stood. He thought of the men he had led into a disastrous charge that same day against wiser counsel, and of what it would mean for the rest of his life, however long or short that life might now prove to be, if he turned and fled inside at the very sight of one approaching enemy. Better, he told himself, standing alone before the gates of the city he had defended for 10 years, to face what was coming directly, and either turn it back or die with whatever honour still remained to him after everything this war had already taken. But as Achilles drew close enough across the plain for the light to catch fully on that shield forged in a god's own furnace, something in Hector's resolve, held so carefully in place until that moment, finally broke apart entirely. He turned, and for the first time in 10 years of war, Troy's greatest defender ran from the battlefield rather than standing to see what was coming. This was not cowardice exactly, not in the way that word is usually meant among soldiers. It was closer to simple human terror in the face of a man who no longer seemed entirely human himself, soaked and blood-spattered, and burning with a grief so complete it had erased whatever mercy might once have tempered him. Hector ran, and Achilles came after him, and the chase that followed carried the two men in a full circuit around the walls of Troy, past the very springs where Trojan women had once washed their linens in the years before the war, back when the worst danger those washing pools had known was nothing more than a quarrel over whose turn it was at the water's edge. 3 times the two warriors circled the city that way, Hector always just ahead, Achilles always just behind, close enough that the watching soldiers on both sides held their breath at every turn, certain the distance between them would close at any moment. Every god on Olympus paused whatever business immortals occupy themselves with to watch this single race unfold below them. Even Zeus himself, father of gods and men, lifted his golden scales. He set the fates of both warriors upon them, one measure for Hector, one for Achilles. Hector's side sank slowly downward toward the earth. The king of the gods knew, in that instant, exactly how this race would end, and even he would not reach down to change it. Athena finally brought the chase to its close, though not with mercy. She came down to the battlefield, disguised as Deiphobus, one of Hector's own brothers, and appeared at his side just as his strength was beginning to fail him, offering to stand with him against Achilles rather than let him face the Greek alone any longer. Hector, exhausted and profoundly grateful for what he believed was his brother's courage, turned at last to make his stand, feeling for the first time in this long chase that he might not have to meet his death entirely by himself. He did not understand the trick until it was already too late to matter. When he turned to hand his second spear to Deiphobus and found no one standing beside him at all, only empty air where his brother should have been, he understood in a single cold instant exactly what had happened and exactly what it meant. The gods had chosen their side in this final contest, and it was not his own. But even that understanding did not send him running again. He drew the sword still at his belt, and turned fully to face the warrior closing the last distance between them, and asked of him one final favour before the fighting began, that whichever man fell that day, the victor would return the loser's body to his own people, so that proper burial rites might be given, rather than leaving a corpse for dogs and carrion birds to pick apart on the open plain. Achilles' answer carried no mercy in it at all. There were no binding oaths between lions and men, he said, no covenants sworn between wolves and the lambs they hunted, and there would be none struck between the two of them either. One of them was going to die on that ground, and that alone was the only understanding left between them worth naming. The two warriors closed the last of the distance, and it was Achilles who struck first and struck true, driving his spear through the single gap left exposed in Hector's borrowed armour, the very armour stripped days before from the body of Patroclus, at the vulnerable, unprotected place where the collarbone meets the throat. Hector fell to the dust of the very ground he had defended for 10 years, and even as life went out of him, he found breath enough for one last warning. He begged once more, weaker now, that his body be returned to his family. Achilles refused him even that small mercy, and Hector, dying, offered a warning of his own in return, foretelling that Achilles too would fall soon, struck down at these same city gates by Paris's arrow and the god Apollo's guiding hand. What Achilles did next shocked even the soldiers who had fought at his side for 10 long years without flinching at much of anything. He pierced the tendons of Hector's ankles, threaded a leather strap through the wounds, and bound the body by its heels to the back of his own chariot. Then he drove out in a wide circuit before the walls of Troy, dragging the corpse of the city's greatest defender through the dust in full view of the ramparts. Again and again, a display of vengeance that seemed, however long it continued, to satisfy nothing at all in the man carrying it out. On the walls above, Priam had to be physically restrained by the soldiers around him from rushing out through the gates to meet his son's killer with nothing but his bare, aged hands. Hecuba wailed for the child she had once nursed at her own breast, her cries carrying out over the whole grieving city. Hector's wife Andromache had been inside the palace at her loom when the news reached her, still weaving a cloak she meant for her husband's return. She ran to the ramparts and looked down to see him dragged through the dirt below. In that single, unbearable moment, she understood exactly what now awaited her, and what awaited the infant son still cradled against her chest. A city that had just lost its greatest defender, she knew better than anyone watching that morning, was a city that had very little time left to it at all. Achilles' fury did not cool with Hector's death, not entirely and not quickly. He held funeral games for Patroclus that stretched across several days, chariot races and wrestling matches and archery contests held in his fallen friend's honour before the assembled Greek army, prizes of tripods and horses and captive women handed out to the victors of each event. Each night, though, once the games were finished and the camp had gone quiet, he remained unsatisfied. He yoked Hector's body once more to his chariot and dragged it in a circle around Patroclus's tomb, as though grief itself might finally wear itself out through sheer repetition. It did not. The gods themselves, watching this same desecration continue night after night with no end in sight, grew troubled by what they saw and moved to preserve Hector's body from the corruption and disfigurement it should long since have suffered under such treatment, holding it whole and untouched, awaiting a resolution that only a grieving father's own courage would finally be able to bring about. The resolution the gods were waiting for came one night when an old man, alone and entirely unguarded, made his way through the darkness into the very heart of the Greek camp. Priam himself had come, guided in secret past every sentry by the god Hermes, to kneel before the very man who had killed his son. He knelt, and he pressed his lips to the hands that had killed Hector, the same hands that had already killed so many of his other sons in this long war, and he asked for nothing more than his son's body back, so that Troy might finally give its greatest defender the burial he was owed. Achilles looked at the old king kneeling before him, and saw for a moment his own aging father Peleus, far away and destined one day to grieve a son in exactly this same way. The two men wept together that night, and Achilles relented, releasing Hector's body and calling a truce so that Troy might mourn without fear of attack. For 11 days the city grieved its greatest son, and then the war went on. 10 years is a long time to camp on a foreign beach, and by the war's final winter both sides had lost more than either could easily count. Achilles himself was dead by then. Hector's dying prophecy had come true. Paris, no warrior himself, loosed an arrow from a safe distance at the Scaean gates, and the god Apollo, the old stories say, guided its flight to the one place Thetis's river had never touched, the heel by which she had held him as an infant. Achilles fell at the same gates where he had once run down Hector 3 times around the city walls. His body was carried from the field by Ajax, the same giant of a man who had once held the burning ships alone, while the Trojans watched in disbelief that the warrior they feared above all others could be killed by the one brother in Troy who had never wanted to fight at all. Troy still stood. 10 years of raids, 10 years of siege, and the walls a god was said to have helped raise had not fallen once. Every exhausted soldier left on that shore could see it plainly now. Troy would never be taken by force. It would have to be taken by a trick. The man who devised that trick was Odysseus, king of Ithaca, the same man who had once tried to escape this entire war by feigning madness behind a plough. His plan was audacious in its simplicity. The Greeks would build an enormous wooden horse, hollow within, large enough to hide a company of their finest warriors inside its belly. The rest of the army would burn its camp, board its ships, and sail away from the Trojan shore as though abandoning the siege in defeat, only to hide the fleet behind a nearby island, waiting for a signal while the horse sat alone on the empty beach, a strange offering left behind by a vanquished enemy. One soldier, a man named Sinon, stayed behind to be captured and to lie. When the Trojans woke to find the Greek camp burned and the ships gone, they could hardly believe the war was finally over. Sinon was dragged before Priam and told his carefully built lie that the Greeks had built the horse as an offering to Athena, made too large to pass through Troy's gates, so the city could never claim her favour for itself. A priest named Laocoön argued against bringing it inside, and drove his spear into its flank to prove his warning. 2 serpents rose from the sea and crushed him and his sons before the horrified crowd. To a people exhausted by 10 years of grief, it seemed unmistakable proof that the gods had already chosen a side. The Trojans tore down a piece of their own wall, the very wall that had held for a decade, simply to drag the horse inside. That night, Troy did something it had not done in 10 years. It was a celebration. Wine flowed through streets that had known only grief and rationing, and the city, worn down at last by its own relief, fell into a deep and unguarded sleep. In the darkness, Sinon lit a signal fire on the shore, and the Greek warriors hidden inside the horse's belly dropped down into a city, with no walls left standing and no soldiers awake to notice them. What followed was not a battle, it was a slaughter. Fires spread from house to house. Priam was killed at his own household altar, cut down while seeking the one sanctuary that should have protected him. Hector's infant son was thrown from the city walls, so that no heir might grow to avenge his father. Andromache, who had once run to the ramparts still clutching her weaving shuttle, was taken into slavery along with the rest of the royal household. Helen, the woman whose face had launched this entire war a decade before, was found and reclaimed by Menelaus, her first husband. Though whether their reunion brought relief or something far more complicated, the old poets leave carefully unresolved. By morning, the city that had stood behind its walls for 10 years was ash and rubble, brought down not by a decade of spears, but by one night of wine and a wooden gift no one thought to distrust in time. The story of Troy did not end entirely in its own ashes. A Trojan prince named Aeneas escaped the burning city carrying his own aged father on his back, and his descendants, later tradition tells us, would go on to found Rome itself, carrying some thread of Troy's memory into an empire that would one day rule the very Mediterranean in which this war had been fought. The city itself did not stay lost forever either. On the Turkish coast today stands a low mound called Hisarlik, and beneath it archaeologists have found not one Troy but 9, each city built on the ruins of the last, layer stacked on layer across 3,000 years. Somewhere in those layers is a thin band of ash and broken stone, still there to be walked, that some believe is the very destruction this story has just described. The phrase Trojan horse has long outlived every wall it once brought down, surviving into our own age as a name for any danger disguised as a gift, any threat that slips past our defences simply because we welcomed it in ourselves. And the names endure too, carried forward not on stone but in the words of a blind poet and in every retelling since. Helen, whose choice or whose theft no version of the story has ever fully resolved. Hector, still remembered as the rare man in this whole bloody saga who fought only for the people he loved, rather than for plunder or pride. Achilles, whose rage cost him the one friend he could not live without, and who learned that lesson only after it was too late to matter. And Priam, an old king kneeling in an enemy's tent at midnight, finding in another father's grief something closer to peace than 10 years of war had ever given him. We began this story with a golden apple rolled in spite across a wedding hall's marble floor, 3 goddesses quarreling over a single carved word, and a young shepherd prince asked to judge between them on a quiet hillside. It is worth remembering, now that the fires of Troy have gone cold and its walls lie broken in the dust, that the entire war traced back to that one small, human moment, an ordinary man's desire weighed unknowingly against the fates of 2 great cities and everyone who lived inside them. Perhaps that is the truest lesson the Iliad still carries down to us after all these centuries. The grandest catastrophes in human history so often begin not with armies or ambition, but with a single choice made by a single person who could never have imagined, standing on that quiet hillside, everything it would eventually cost. Thank you for joining me on this long journey into the past. I hope the story of Troy, its heroes, its grief, and its fall has brought the beauty and the sorrow of the ancient world to life for you tonight. Until our next journey into history, I wish you a calm and peaceful night.